we're going to bring Keith into the conversation. By the way, I saw a stat about Thibault. When he plays 20 or more minutes, they're like 13-1.
Yeah, I saw that
too. They play under 20 minutes, they're like 10-13. So they got to get him more than 20 minutes. Keith Smith is with us, more NBA conversation. He is a contributor for Yahoo Sports, Real GM, Celtics blog, and he joins us every Wednesday to talk some hoops. And get your thoughts on that, Keith. You know, the Sixers had not been playing very well, and they had that 4-game streak on the road, and then there's some, accountability and leadership stuff. When you start to hear that kind of stuff, what do you see from the Sixers during that road trip? And then, of course, they came home, which they played much better, and they beat Oklahoma City. So much to do about nothing, or you think something's there?
It's probably a little bit of both. I think when you get into the NBA season, every team goes through a little bit of a rough patch. I mean, the Lakers a few weeks ago went through, or not even a few weeks ago, only a couple weeks ago, went through a 4-game losing streak. And people were all of a sudden, maybe the team's not as good as we thought they were. And it happens. But on the flip side with Philly, we're starting to hear, again, some of the things we heard last season and the year before about it's a lot of young guys, and these two guys maybe don't see eye to eye, and do they really listen to the coach, and is he the guy to get the most out of them? When you start hearing those stories over and over and over again, multiple years in a row, it does perk up your interest. But I think it's probably more that it was just a rough patch in the schedule, and that's what happened.
Obviously a lot of talk recently the other day when Brett Brown came out. He was asked about Ben Simmons. Now, he had a 3 against Cleveland back on December 7th. After that game, he said, I would like to see him shoot 1 per game minimum. Well, I think we can all collectively guess how many he's taken since that night, and the answer is 0. So he said, evidently, I have failed. What do you think his message is there? He said, I have failed. I have not got him to do this. But he also threw in the caveat at the end, this is something that Ben has to want to do. So how do you read those comments on Simmons?
Yeah, I think that's basically, without getting real vile about it, he's calling the player out. He's saying, look, I want you to shoot those shots. I want you to take them. But on the flip side, he's not going to take them. We know at this point. He's not going to come down, come off a screen, take 2 dribbles, pull up, and shoot a 3. It's just not going to happen. It's not in his game. It's not who he wants to be. So that's a little bit on Brown then. If you want him to take 1 per game minimum, then you better manufacture him at least 1 wide-open attempt per game. Now, some will say, well, that's there, and he's still not doing it. Well, maybe that's true. And if that's the case, then if you're Brown, you have to really start to say, well, what's the point of saying it? Because if you're not going to do anything about it, if you're not going to pull him out of the game when he passes up open shots and sit him and say, look, if you're not going to take him, I can't play you, then what's the point of really talking about it? I think at that point you just start to say, all right, this is what it is, and let's all move on, because he's not all of a sudden going to start turning into Ray Allen or Reggie Miller out here.
Well,
I think that's not going to happen.
I think that's what he's trying to do, Keith. Like, he said something. He says, I guess I added some fuel to this, but it's so overblown. So, I mean, look, I do think Brown is in kind of a tough situation, and I'll ask your opinion on this. Can an NBA coach bench his star player of the magnitude of Ben Simmons? Can the coach say, hey, LeBron James, I'm not saying he's LeBron James, but can you see a player of that magnitude getting benched?
And is that even the answer?
Yeah, I would start with, can he? Sure, if he's not overly concerned about being the coach for very long. Because if you sit Ben Simmons, and because he won't shoot a 3-pointer and the team loses the game, well, we all know what the story is. We know what you're going to be talking about the next day. He pulled Simmons out and they lost anyway, so what was the point? And you do that too many times, and all of a sudden you're on the unemployment line. But is that the answer? Probably not. I think the answer is just forget about it. Just let it go. It's not going to be a thing. If at this point, if we look at it and say he's just not going to be that guy, he's not going to shoot jump shots, I think you need to move on and really start to think about, all right, if this is still our guy, how do we maximize his singular talents that don't involve shooting the basketball and make sure that we get the absolute most out of him? Because we're in, year 4-ish, essentially, for Simmons. Now, we need to look at this and say, if that's not who he's going to be, that's not who he's going to be, and let's all move on. Because once you're starting to get to year 4, 5, 6 in the NBA, we pretty much know, not that guys don't improve and get better, but we pretty much know who you are as a player at that point. We have a pretty good idea. You might add a small thing here or there, but going from a complete non-shooter, unwilling shooter to a shooter, that's probably not going to happen.
Well, Keith, I don't want to say he's Giannis Antetokounmpo by any stretch, but I mean he's a big ball handler who's very athletic, goes downhill. Antetokounmpo did not shoot a lick until basically this year and last year. I mean, he's up to almost 6.3 attempts per game. He didn't shoot hardly any in his first 5 years. Last year, I think he was up to around 2. But he just became a willing guy. He's not a good shooter, but he's a willing shooter. Can't Ben Simmons become that guy? Just a will. And another thing with Giannis is he got to the line 4 times, 5 times. He now gets to the line like 11 times a game because he's a willing. He's not a great free throw shooter, but he's a willing. Like, to me, that's all Ben Simmons needs is just to become a willing shooter. Not a great shooter, a willing shooter.
Yeah, and I think that's two very different things. I think the first part is Giannis would, when even from his rookie year, when he was left completely wide open at the perimeter, he'd take it. And he was encouraged from day one, take those shots. We want you to take them because I think they saw if this guy is ever going to maximize his potential, we need him to be willing to let it fly when he's left completely wide open with no one within 10, 15 feet of him. Now, the free throw thing, that's a different thing. Simmons should be a guy who should be able to get to the line 7, 8, 9, 10 times a game just because he's huge. He's a great ball handler. He's tough for any big to handle off the bounce. He's crafty inside. But what you start to see is when guys are those kind of unwilling shooters and they don't really have the confidence in doing it, what we see is they break down the defender to get into the paint, and it's a pass, or it's a fadeaway, or it's something that's not going to draw contact and get themselves to the line because he's the type of guy who has the ability and skill to get himself to the line regularly. Does he have the confidence, though, to go there and knock them down on a consistent basis? That's the question, and that's where you need to get him either built up there or, again, you need to say, all right, that's not what he's going to be, so how do we maximize and build this roster around him to make sure we get the most out of him?
Keith, I just want to ask you one more regarding Simmons. So, you said move on.
Can you tell he's a little bit of a topic around here, Keith?
Yeah, just a tiny one.
Right?
You said move on from just the questions and everything surrounding will he, won't he, with his shot and expanding his offensive game. But was this roster built on the idea that Ben Simmons was going to develop his game? So let's say this is the Ben Simmons that we're going to see now for the rest of this season at minimum. How does that impact?
Like, did they sign him to that big extension at the table and say, hey,
right,
this is predicated on you expanding your game?
Exactly, and we're going to build this roster a certain way, and we need you to grow here. So he's not growing. How does this impact their philosophy, how Brett Brown decides to call plays, and everything that they do? Because it's a very clunky team and offense with Ben and his game currently.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. I think one was the hope was that adding a guy like Al Horford, locking up Tobias Harris, you had shooters. The hope was you were putting enough shooting around him. And it was shooters in a different way. Instead of going the more traditional wing shooter type, they went with bigs who can step out and shoot. And I think that was the hope, was those guys were going to be able to do that. Now, that hasn't really panned out. But if the idea was when they sat down and laid out the off-season plan was, all right, well, we can add bigs and we can lock up Harris, who's, still a forward, still a, more of a traditional four, but we're going to play him at the 3 kind of thing, because our belief is that Simmons is going to all of a sudden start turning into a guy who will shoot the ball with regularity from the perimeter. That, to me, that's probably faulty logic then. If that's how the roster was built when they sat down and planned this out, and that's just building a roster on hope versus reality, and that's not really a smart thing to do when you're at the position Philadelphia was in. If this was 3-4 years ago, as you're just kind of starting to turn the corner and become a more competitive team, that's when you build a roster around hope versus reality. The reality is you're already pretty good, in what has panned out hasn't really, what has come together hasn't really panned out the way that they had hoped it would.
Yeah, and when I say built around regarding that assumption, I've been saying it since day one. It's not about shooting threes, but it's about wanting the ball and wanting to go to the foul line, as you touched on a couple minutes ago.
Although Brett has kind of said, I don't care, but if he wants to do the pull-up two, that's fine.
Yeah.
But we want him shooting threes.
Right, and I know that's a big part of it, but the fact that he's not even willing to want the ball in key situations,
He ain't
I think,
shooting pull-up twos either.
No, or even going to the paint late in the game. But how does Embiid fit into all this? Because we're talking about how the roster is built, and it doesn't seem like it's working right now, mainly with Horford and Embiid. Horford has a certain style. You say they brought him in here to shoot threes, but he was heavy pick and roll. Offense went through him in Boston. That's not the case here. So talk about that aspect.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that go into that. I think with Al Horford, he's a guy who needs to be involved. I know he had recent comments of, he just doesn't get to do much. And I think when you're basically saying go be a spot-up guy, it's not that he can't do that. But I think if you're saying spot up and you're going to touch it 1 out of every 4 possessions, and if you're open, we want you to shoot, that's not the kind of guy he is. That's never been the guy he is. He needs to be involved. He needs to have the ball. You need to play through him a little bit to get him there. As you said, heavy pick and roll, pick and pop guy. More pick and pop as he's gotten a little bit older. So that changed his game. And then with Embiid, I think the challenge with Horford and Embiid is where they're both most comfortable is on the exact same spots on the floor. It's, above the break from around the arc, and then it's on the block. And it's generally on that left block where they can get the ball in and they can go to work for that hook in the lane or get to a layup or something like that. That's really tough when you're asking those two guys. And then when you're talking about the rest of the spacing around them isn't giving, never mind 2 of them, the ability to work like that. It's not really even giving one of them. That makes it really hard to build a functional offense. And you just to touch on one other thing you said with Simmons is that's exactly it. It's the unwillingness to even shoot the ball makes it hard. Bad shooters, for example, a guy like Marcus Smart, who's not a very good shooter, but he is willing. You still have to respect and defend the fact that he might pull it in maybe 1 out of every 5 games. He's hot, and you've got to really get out there on him. But when you know as a defense, that guy's not even going to shoot, you're now playing 5-on-4 defensively, and that makes everything much, much easier because you can roam, you can float, you can play kind of junky zones, you can double, you can do all sorts of things because you've got one player who's just not going to shoot the ball.
Keith Smith, Yahoo NBA, of course, covers the league, you've been around the Celtics a lot. When you see Horford, the way he was in Boston, and now you've seen him for about 35, 40 games here in Philly, are you kind of perplexed at the way they're using him, or do you think there is a way they can integrate him? There's certain people here that are already ready to trade him.
Yeah, I'm a little perplexed. I'm also a little bit sad because I think you're not maximizing Al Horford as what he's been as a player with the way he's been used. I think you need to. There's no reason why, with Simmons' ability as a ball handler and a passer, why you can't run more pick and roll plays, pick and pop plays with them. The fact that that's not a staple function of their offense, I get that's not what Brett Brown wants to run, but it screams you should be doing this. And you could even run inverted stuff where Horford is the main ball handler and he's the initiator of the offense. And that allows Simmons to play as a role man, or that allows Embiid to do more things as a role man. And all of a sudden, now you're opening up an offensive game that looks a little bit different. But the challenge is, even Josh Richardson, that's a guy who, with the Miami Heat, he played a lot of point guard. He had the ball in his hands a lot and was creating out of the pick and roll. And they don't really do that. It's a lot of movement offense, screening away, doing those kind of things versus the staple NBA action. But to go back to Horford, can you make it work? Yeah, but you have to make it work. You have to be willing to adjust what you do. The challenge is we're about halfway through the season now, and ask teams to change who they are, that's really difficult. And you'd be asking this team to really do that 3 times in the span of less than a year when you go all the way back to last year with all the trades, this year with the new players via the signings and the trades, and now you're going to have to change again. All of a sudden the players start to say, well, what are we doing here? Because we're completely changing the way we play 3 straight years, or 3 times within 1 year, I guess.
Yeah, it almost seems, Keith, that the Sixers saw the way Horford, what he did against them, and then just kind of figured he could be a stretch 4 and just shoot threes. He's, and that's not really his best attribute, right?
It's one of his best attributes, but it's not his best attribute. His best attribute is when you give him the ball and you let him kind of make plays from up top. You let him.
He's not a guy who's going to sit in the corner like a stretch four and shoot corner threes all night.
No, especially not when he's not seeing it regularly. If you're going to commit to getting him a touch every single possession and do that, because guys need to feel the ball, they need to be involved. If you're going to commit to do that, and then the play ultimately ends with him spotting up, then maybe it works a little bit better. But when it's 1 out of every 4 trips, then he finally sees the ball and you're expecting him to shoot. No, unless that's your role in the league, unless you're a Ryan Anderson type, who stands out there, Brooke Lopez, who can go multiple possessions without a touch and then let one fly, that's fine. I think with Horford, what it ultimately to me said was we can hurt Boston, who we've been trying to beat, and he's a guy we can throw against Giannis, who we know we're going to have to beat to get to where we want to be. And it was one of those things where, those two things are accomplished, but does it fit? And that's where it's been kind of messy all year long.
Keith, what are your thoughts about making a lineup change and potentially having Horford come off the bench?
Yeah, I think that's tough, just from the standpoint of, one, you're going to look at it and say, we're paying this guy $100 million over the next 4 years to be a backup. Yeah. I don't know that there's necessarily enough minutes there. I mean, when Embiid's going to play, it's going to be 30, 32 minutes a night. And if you're saying, well, they're still going to play 20 minutes a night together, I think you still have to bite the bullet and say, let's make those minutes as the starters. But it might be something that's worth trying. But the question I would ask is, who comes in the lineup in place of him that's going to make it any better than what he already does? Because if you don't already have that guy, then now you run the risk of, are we really mess things up here? Because NBA players, we all know they're sensitive. You ask them to change their role, it better go well, or they're going to make sure they're not happy about it.
All right, so when you add up all the stuff when you see this team, what do you think is this team's biggest issue? Coach, system, players, fit? I mean, there's a lot here. I mean, and they're not a bad team. It's just that I think and I kind of said, I think that the expectations kind of got out of whack a little bit. I mean, this is a team that went from 28 wins to 52. They're led by 2 guys in their early 20s, and we want them to be championship material already. Are they where they should be? I mean, so this is a very polarizing franchise, obviously, because of how they got here. But when you watch them and look at this whole thing, what's their biggest issue?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. It's the players and the fit. I've been telling you guys all year long, I don't think they have enough shooting. I don't think they have enough of that. I'm now worried. I don't know if they have enough creative players on offense. I think you're really relying on Ben Simmons, who, as we talked about earlier, sometimes won't do it, and then Josh Richardson. And then after that, who's creating any kind of offense off the dribble for this team? And that's what wins in playoffs. If you can't win one-on-one and beat your man, you're going to struggle. You're not going to be able to play. You can only gain so many points through your system in the playoffs. But that said, I don't want to go crazy. I mean, I think what happens with this team, more than any other team in the NBA, when they look good, they look really good. When they look bad, they are the worst fear that everybody had for them. And they look really terrible, but they look good more than they look bad. Challenge is, in the NBA, for years and years and years, anybody can make the jump from non-playoff team to playoff team. Making the jump from playoff team to contender, that's the harder jump to make, and only a handful of teams do it from year in, year out.
Keith Smith, NBA, of course, the Bucks leading the way. Celtics firmly at number 2. Actually, Miami and Boston firmly at number 2. They are 5 games back of the Bucks. And then there's the next level down. Toronto is the 4. Philly is the 5. Indiana's pretty good at 6. So you got a much deeper and better East than we thought. So I don't know. It's not just a rite of passage that Philly is going to start playing better and then overtake some of these teams. This is going to be a fight to get into those top 3 seeds in the East, it looks like.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think what we're starting to see in the East, and I don't want to go crazy because we're not quite at the halfway mark here, but you're starting to see it slot in its years where you've got Milwaukee. They're so far out and ahead of everybody else as a regular season team. It's not even funny. If you go back and look at their numbers, they're historically great. The things that they're doing right now, their net differential is 12 something points a game, and just kind of rocking everybody. But then when you get it into Boston, Miami, and that next group, and then Toronto, Philly, and Indiana, I think Philly has the potential and will climb out of that that group and be more within that Boston Miami mix. Maybe Miami slides back a little. They're starting to some things are cropping up with them injury wise, some fit things with them as well. But I think the East is definitely a much better conference than anybody thought, and that's because teams like Indiana, they've hung in there without Victor Oladipo. And Toronto's been better than most people I think gave them credit for, considering they lost Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green this offseason. They've been much better than people thought, as well as the Celtics. I think there was a little bit of premature shovel dirt on him because Kyrie Irving and Al Horford left, when I think it was forgotten, hey, this team had a lot of good players and some young guys who were a lot better 2 years ago than they necessarily looked last year. And obviously Gordon Hayward back healthy, playing good basketball.
The trade deadline is approaching quicker than we realized, and there's a lot of talk surrounding, obviously, the Sixers. As we mentioned, Horford is being mentioned for the people that think the world is completely ending. But just an overall overview, Keith, of what you expect potentially for the trade deadline.
Yeah, we're starting to get a sense that it might be busier than we thought. Initially, because there was so much movement this past summer, it sounded like it was going to be kind of a dud of a trade deadline. But there's a lot of teams that are looking at it and saying there's only 6-7 teams that are going to have cap space this summer. And it's only a handful of them that have any kind of meaningful cap space. It is a dreadful free agent class this year, really, really bad. And then some folks say, well, teams will flip and prioritize to the summer 2021 when guys like Giannis are a free agent. But the challenge is, unless you're maybe one of 3 or 4 teams, you're not silly enough to think you have a real shot at Giannis. So those teams are looking at it and saying, hey, if we think a guy like maybe Kevin Love, who doesn't have the greatest contract in the world, but if we think he is the difference between jumping in what has been as wide open a year as we've had in the last half decade in the league, if we think that he's our difference maker, let's go get him and get it done. So I think we are going to see some deals made and things happen here over the next few weeks.
All right, the NBA trade deadline, a couple of weeks away, February, 8th, 9th, is it?
8th?
Whatever that first Thursday is.
Yeah, so 3 o'clock that day, and of course we'll see what the Sixers do, and they play Boston. No Embiid in that game tomorrow night, so we know that helps Boston out big time. That's the one problem they have, is they got no one for Embiid. It was funny because Boston was kind of dominating Philly for a couple of years. Now it's kind of flipped the other way, where Philly's kind of had Boston's number. But tomorrow night should be interesting to see how that matchup goes with no Embiid in the lineup.
Yeah, it definitely is. It looks like the Celtics should have Kemba Walker and Daniel Tice available. They were both questionable, but they're going to play tonight against the Spurs. The team already announced that. So it looks like Boston will be about as healthy as they've been in several weeks. So we'll see how that looks. But again, it's one of those teams where you're going to say, well, they played without Embiid, so what does it really matter? So we're probably not really going to know a whole heck of a lot about what that means if these two teams meet down the line.
Yeah, interesting story, by the way, out west, too, is now that the season, we're about 35, 40 games in for some of these teams. And you look at the standings, Denver was kind of hanging around, and now they have moved themselves back into the 2 spot. So it shows that Denver is kind of for real. And I like what I was wondering why they weren't playing Michael Porter Jr. earlier. It seems like they're kind of giving him some more. Houston, the Clippers in the 4th spot. So Philly and the Clippers, 2 very heavy favorites early, are both kind of finding their way here. So about 40 games in the NBA season. After Christmas, everybody, the focus starts to really zoom in. I want to ask you this before we leave, though. Were you in the house the other night for Markelle Fultz's career high?
Unfortunately, I was not. I had another engagement, but I did get to see it, and he looked just terrific. I'll tell you, he has played so well for that team, even in the games where he's not putting up big scoring numbers and isn't necessarily shooting it well. What he's given them is terrific defense every single night. He has been a really good defender, and then he's as a playmaker, passer, he's really good. Well, when he's got it going and he has the ball and he's pushing it up the floor and those kind of things, they're just a completely different team. That's a team that really can the board. And Fultz is a massive difference maker for them and has really just had a terrific season.
All right, Keith Smith, of course, every Wednesday we talk NBA. We are now past the Christmas portion, so it starts to really heat up a bunch, and he, like all guests, appear via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Happy New Year, pal.
Hey, thanks, guys. Happy New Year to you and yours as well.